Welcome to this deep dive, and today we're going to be unpacking this really complex world of fast fashion.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be exploring, the impacts that the industry has on the planet and all the legislative efforts across the globe that are trying to push for more sustainability in the industry.
Right.
And we've got a pretty diverse range of sources for this one.
Yeah.
We've got reports from organizations like earthday.org. We've got academic papers that are proposing cutting-edge solutions.
Wow.
Even news articles covering how different countries are approaching this from a legislative angle.
Cool.
And get this, listeners, you're even going to learn about how fashion companies are turning to electric vehicles and using these really complex algorithms to try and make their distribution more sustainable.
That's so interesting. What I find fascinating is that we're not just talking about the environmental impact of fast fashion. It's actually a lot more multifaceted than that. And it has these really deep social and economic consequences.
Okay, so let's start by just defining what we mean by fast fashion.
Yeah.
You're probably already familiar with the term, but it's good to make sure we're all on the same page, before we just dive in.
Absolutely.
So how would you define fast fashion?
So fast fashion is essentially high volume, trend-driven clothing production.
Okay.
And it thrives on speed and keeping costs low. But this often comes at a really steep price for the environment and the people who are actually making our clothes.
Kind of like fast food, but for our wardrobes.
Yeah,
It's cheap and readily available, and it's designed to be consumed really quickly.
Right.
We all know about those mountains of clothes that end up in landfills.
Yeah.
But what are some of the less obvious environmental concerns that are tied to fast fashion?
Well, for starters, there's this massive resource depletion.
Okay.
So that includes things like water, land, raw materials.
Yeah.
The industry uses an incredible amount of resources just to churn out these trendy pieces that are often discarded after just a few wears. And then there's the pollution that's generated during the actual textile production process.
Right.
That includes everything from hazardous chemicals to microplastics.
Oh.
It's kind of a sobering thought, but even something as simple as doing your laundry contributes to this problem.
Really?
Like a single load of laundry can release hundreds of thousands of these microplastic fibers into the water system.
Oh my gosh, I was reading that a staggering 35% of all microplastics found in the ocean actually come from washing our clothes.
It's crazy.
That's huge.
It is.
It really highlights these unintended consequences of our fashion choices that we don't really think about.
Exactly. And speaking of unintended consequences, let's shift our attention to another really pressing issue.
Okay.
The social impact of fast fashion.
Right.
It's no secret that the industry has a long history of exploiting garment workers.
Yeah.
But the reality is often much grimmer than we realize.
So you're talking about the low wages and the dangerous working conditions that we hear about, right?
Yeah, but it actually goes way beyond that. Wow.
We're talking about widespread wage theft, unsafe factories, and just a general lack of protections for these workers.
It's awful.
Yeah, it's really sad. And we've actually seen the really devastating consequences of this negligence.
Yeah, the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh immediately comes to mind when I think about this.
Yeah.
That was back in 2013, I think. And over 1,000 garment workers lost their lives when that building collapsed.
That's terrible.
It's just this stark reminder of the human cost of our desire. Our insatiable appetite for cheap clothing.
It really is. It exposed the deep cracks in the system and underscored the urgent need for systemic change.
Right.
And we also need to acknowledge that these issues are really deeply intertwined with social justice.
Okay.
Things like landfills, for instance.
Yeah.
They're almost 3 times more likely to be located in neighborhoods with a higher percentage of BIPOC residents.
That's environmental injustice for sure.
It is a clear example of environmental injustice. So it's not just about making fashion more sustainable. It's about addressing the inherent inequalities within the system.
Absolutely.
It seems like just relying on ethical sourcing and voluntary corporate social responsibility initiatives isn't enough.
It's not enough.
Do you think legislation is the answer?
It's definitely a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
We need more robust legislation that holds the fashion industry accountable for its practices and creates a level playing field for ethical and sustainable businesses.
So tell me about some of the global legislative efforts that are gaining momentum. What are some of the things that are being done?
Well, one of the most comprehensive initiatives is the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or the CSDDD.
CSDDD.
Yes. And what's really groundbreaking about the CSDDD is that it requires companies to identify and address any potential human rights and environmental impacts throughout their entire supply chain.
Wow.
Even if those impacts are happening in other countries.
That seems like a huge step towards like holding companies accountable for what's happening beyond their own, factory doors.
Right.
Are there similar initiatives in other parts of the world that are gaining traction?
Absolutely. So in the U.S., for example,
Okay.
the Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act is making its way through Congress.
Interesting.
And this act focuses on increasing transparency by requiring brands to publicly disclose their suppliers and the environmental impact of their operations.
So it's like lifting the veil of secrecy and giving consumers the information they need to make better choices.
Exact.
And I know that Canada is also stepping up to the plate with a national strategy for reducing textile waste.
Yes.
So it seems like there's a growing global recognition that we need legislative action in the fashion industry.
There is.
But what about the industry's response to all this pressure?
Right.
Are brands just waiting for regulations to force their hand, or are they actively seeking out solutions themselves?
Well, actually, it's encouraging to see that a lot of brands are starting to take these issues more seriously.
Okay, good.
We're seeing a growing number of companies that are taking proactive steps towards sustainability, even partnering with recycling companies to find new ways to process used clothing and shoes.
So it's not just about recycling. It's about finding innovative ways to repurpose those materials and keep them in circulation.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example of what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, so think about brands like H&M and Levi's.
Okay.
They're partnering with companies like ICO to collect old clothes and shoes.
Nope.
And these partners then sort and process those materials and transform them into new garments or find uses for them in entirely different industries.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is.
It seems like the fashion industry is waking up to the potential of a circular economy,
Yes.
moving away from that traditional take, make, use, dispose model that we're all used to
Right.
towards a more, sustainable grow, make, use, restore approach.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just about recycling. It's also about designing products from the start with circularity in mind.
Oh, interesting.
So some brands are using monomaterials, which are much easier to recycle,
Okay.
and others are incorporating design features that make it easy to disassemble and repair products.
So it's about making it easier to give those clothes like a second or third or even a fourth life.
Exactly.
I love that.
It's really cool.
It's exciting to see these collaborations and initiatives taking shape.
Yeah.
And there's a growing recognition that achieving true sustainability requires like a collective effort from everybody.
It does.
But let's be realistic for a second.
Okay.
There are still massive challenges, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do we balance ethical practices and the need for systemic change with the constant consumer demand for those low prices? Because people have become accustomed to cheap clothing.
Yes.
And changing that mindset seems like a pretty big hurdle to overcome.
Absolutely. You're right. There is a real tension between ethical practices and the fast fashion model that thrives on low prices and constant consumption.
Yeah.
And then there's also the sheer complexity of these global supply chains.
Oh, my goodness.
It makes it incredibly difficult to enforce regulations and ensure ethical practices when production is scattered all over the globe.
So it sounds like we need a multifaceted approach to tackle this issue from every angle possible.
Me too.
But like, where do we even begin?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that we can't rely on just a single solution.
Okay.
It requires collaboration between brands, policymakers, and consumers.
Right.
Brands need to be more transparent and accountable. Policymakers need to implement and enforce strong regulations. And
consumers need to be more conscious of their choices and the impact those choices have.
Exactly.
We can't just keep buying into this cycle of disposable clothing.
We can't.
We need to shift our thinking from quantity to quality.
Right.
And valuing those well-made clothes that last longer.
Yeah.
And embrace the idea of repairing and upcycling
Mm-hmm.
instead of just tossing clothes at the first sign of wear and tear.
I love that.
And we can't forget about supporting those brands that align with our values.
Absolutely.
Choosing those slow fashion options that prioritize ethics and sustainability sends a strong message to the rest of the industry.
It really does.
It's about making more mindful choices and recognizing that our individual actions can contribute to a larger movement.
They do.
But what about those exciting innovations in the realm of sustainable distribution?
Oh, yeah.
I'm really intrigued by the idea of companies using electric vehicles for delivery.
Yeah, that research on sustainable distribution really caught my eye too.
Cool.
One model that companies are exploring is called vehicle battery separation.
What?
So instead of having to charge the electric vehicles, which can take a lot of time, they simply swap out depleted batteries for fully charged ones,
Oh, wow.
which significantly reduces downtime and makes distribution much more efficient.
So it's not just about reducing emissions. It's about finding creative ways to make sustainable practices more practical and efficient.
Exactly.
That's incredible. But before we get too deep into the specifics of electric vehicles, I think it's time for us to shift gears and explore this concept of circularity in a little bit more detail.
Great idea. There's so much to unpack when it comes to the circular economy and its potential to revolutionize the fashion industry.
Let's dive in. So we're diving back into this world of sustainable fashion,
Okay.
and specifically this idea of a circular economy.
Right.
Can you just explain what a circular economy is and how it applies to the fashion industry?
Yeah, so it's basically a big shift from the linear take, make, use, dispose model that's been so dominant for so long.
Right.
A circular economy aims to keep materials in use for as long as possible,
Okay.
minimizing waste and maximizing resource efficiency throughout the entire life cycle of a product.
So instead of clothes just ending up in landfills after a few wears,
Right.
they're designed and produced with the intention of being recycled or repurposed.
Yes, exactly.
That sounds great in theory, but how does this play out in the real world?
Yeah.
What are some tangible examples?
Well, we're already seeing brands like H&M and Levi's partnering with recycling companies
Okay.
to collect old clothes and shoes.
Interesting.
And then these partners sort and process those materials and transform them into new garments,
Wow.
or even find uses for them in completely different industries.
So it's not just about recycling.
Right.
It's about giving those materials a second life in innovative ways.
Exactly.
Are there limits to how much we can actually recycle or repurpose?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What happens to materials that can't be reused?
So that's where the concept of designing for circularity comes in.
Okay.
So some brands are starting to use monomaterials,
Monomaterials.
which are much easier to recycle because they're made from a single type of material.
Oh, interesting.
And others are incorporating design elements that make it easy to disassemble and repair products,
Right.
which extends their lifespan.
So it's not just an afterthought. It's baked into the design process from the beginning.
Exactly, from the very beginning.
But what about those slow fashion brands that we talked about earlier?
Right.
How do they fit into this circular economy model?
So slow fashion brands are often at the forefront of this whole movement.
Okay.
They tend to prioritize natural biodegradable materials, which reduces our reliance on synthetic fibers that can take hundreds of years to decompose.
Yeah.
And they often produce smaller collections,
Oh, yeah.
focusing on quality and durability over those fleeting trends.
It's about creating pieces that are meant to be cherished and worn for years, not just a single season.
Exactly.
But isn't slow fashion often more expensive?
It can be.
How do we make these options more accessible to a wider range of consumers?
Well, that's a really valid point.
Yeah.
Slow fashion can be more expensive, but it's important to consider the true cost of fast fashion. The environmental damage, the exploitation of workers. Those costs aren't reflected in those low price tags. And as consumers become more aware of these issues, we're seeing a growing demand for ethically and sustainably produced clothing.
So it's about educating consumers
Yeah.
and helping them understand that investing in a few high-quality, durable pieces
Right.
might actually be more cost-effective in the long run.
It might be, yeah.
But it's not just about what we buy, is it?
No, it's not.
It's also about how we care for our clothes.
Absolutely. Extending the life of our garments through proper care and repair is a crucial part of this circular economy.
Okay.
Simple things like washing clothes in cold water air drying instead of using a dryer,
Right.
learning some basic mending skills. These can all significantly reduce the environmental impact of our wardrobes.
Yeah, I've been trying to get better about mending my own clothes,
Good for you.
but I'll admit I'm not very skilled at it.
It takes practice.
Are there resources available for people who want to learn these skills?
There are tons of resources available, from online tutorials to workshops offered by local businesses and community organizations. And there's actually this growing movement of people who are embracing visible mending. They're turning those little imperfections into unique design elements.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah, it's about challenging the idea that everything needs to be perfect
Yeah.
and embracing the beauty of imperfection.
I love that.
It's great.
It's about appreciating the story that each garment tells and giving it new life,
Right.
rather than just like discarding it.
I love that.
It seems like this shift toward a circular economy requires like a fundamental change in our relationship with consumption and like material possessions in general.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
It's a recalibration of our values.
Do we really need to buy new clothes every season?
Right.
Can we find contentment and style with what we already have?
Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves.
It's a question we all need to ask ourselves.
Yes.
And it's not about deprivation.
No, it's not.
It's about finding joy in different ways.
Right.
In the quality of our clothes, in the stories they tell, and in like the act of caring for them.
Exactly.
Do you think this shift is actually happening?
I think it is.
Are we seeing real progress toward a more sustainable fashion industry?
I believe the shift is happening and it's gaining momentum.
Okay.
They're seeing more and more people embracing sustainability,
Yeah.
demanding transparency from brands, and supporting those ethical and circular businesses.
That's encouraging to hear.
It is.
But what about those challenges we discussed earlier, like
Right.
balancing ethical practices with that consumer demand for low prices?
Yeah.
And like the complexities of these global supply chains.
Yes.
Have those hurdles disappeared?
They haven't disappeared overnight, but the fact that we're having these conversations, that legislation is being enacted, and that these innovative solutions are emerging is all incredibly encouraging.
So it's not about finding like a magic bullet solution.
No?
It's about chipping away at the problem from multiple angles.
Right.
And this is like a long game, right?
It is a long game.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
It's a marathon we can win if we work together.
I love that optimism.
We have the knowledge, the technology, and the collective will to make fashion more sustainable.
But how do we shift the mindset of those who are just like so accustomed to that fast fashion model?
Yeah.
How do we make sustainable fashion more appealing and accessible to a wider audience?
I think it's about education and awareness,
Okay.
showing people the true cost of their choices.
Right.
We need to highlight the environmental damage and the human exploitation that often go hand in hand with fast fashion.
Right.
But we also need to showcase the positive alternatives.
Okay.
We need to demonstrate the beauty and value of sustainable and ethical fashion.
So it's not just about preaching.
Yeah.
It's about inspiring and empowering people to make different choices.
Exactly.
How can we do that effectively?
Storytelling is a really powerful tool.
Okay.
We need to use compelling visuals and narratives to highlight the brands and designers who are leading the way.
Right.
We need to celebrate those who are championing sustainability and ethical practices, making them role models for others to follow.
And we need to make it easier for consumers to make those sustainable choices.
We do.
That means providing clear information, promoting transparency in the supply chain, and making those ethical and circular options readily available both online and in stores.
Yes, making it easy.
It's about creating an environment where sustainability isn't just an option.
Right.
It's the default.
Exactly. And I think that's achievable.
I think so too. But it's not just about individual choices.
It's not.
We need systemic change.
We do.
And that brings us back to those legislative initiatives we were discussing earlier.
Right.
They play a crucial role in creating the framework for this transition to a more sustainable fashion system.
They do. Legislation can set standards, create incentives for innovation, and hold companies accountable for their actions.
Yeah.
It can help to create a level playing field, ensuring that everyone is operating under the same rules and striving for the same goals.
But how effective can these legislative efforts be, like in practice?
Yeah.
Are there any examples of policies that have successfully driven positive change in the fashion industry?
There are. France's law requiring all new washing machines to have built-in microfiber filters is a great example.
Oh, wow.
It's targeted legislation tackling a very specific source of pollution.
Cool.
And the Netherlands has an extended producer responsibility scheme for textiles,
Okay.
which means that producers are responsible for the recycling and reuse of the products they sell in the country.
So there's a range of approaches being implemented globally.
There are.
But what about enforcement?
Right.
How can we ensure that these regulations are actually being followed, especially when we're dealing with these like complex global supply chains?
It's definitely a challenge, but as consumers become more demanding and as transparency becomes increasingly important,
Yeah.
brands will be under more pressure to comply.
Right.
And a lot of these legislative initiatives also come with mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement, including things like fines and penalties for noncompliance.
So it sounds like it's not just about top-down regulation.
It's not.
It's also about empowering those grassroots movements and fostering collaboration between those different stakeholders.
Right.
Brands, policymakers, consumers, everyone in between.
Everyone, it truly takes a village.
You're absolutely right. It's a system in transition.
It is.
And it requires a collective effort to navigate this shift toward a more sustainable and ethical fashion industry.
Absolutely.
And it's exciting to be a part of this conversation.
It is.
To witness this change happening in real time.
Yes.
But it's also a bit overwhelming.
It is.
There's so much information to process and so many different facets to consider.
I agree. It can feel like drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that we don't need to have all the answers. We're all on a learning journey.
Yeah.
And every small step we take contributes to this larger movement.
So where do we go from here?
Well,
how do we move from awareness to action?
I think the first step is to continue educating ourselves and staying informed about these issues.
Okay.
Read articles, listen to podcasts, engage in conversations, and ask questions.
Right.
And as we learn, we can start to make more conscious choices in our own lives.
Right.
We can support brands that align with our values. We can care for our clothes more thoughtfully, and we can advocate for change within our own communities.
And most importantly, we need to be patient with ourselves and with each other.
Yes.
This is a complex issue with no easy solutions.
It is.
But if we approach it with curiosity, compassion, and a willingness to learn, I believe we can create a more sustainable and ethical future for fashion.
I love that message of hope and collective action.
I do too. But before we get too carried away with all this newfound optimism,
Okay.
let's take a moment to acknowledge that there are still some hard truths we need to face about the fashion industry.
You're right. Despite all the positive developments we've discussed, there's still a long way to go.
Yeah.
And there are some uncomfortable realities we can't ignore.
Let's dig into those in our final segment.
Okay.
We've talked about all those positive shifts that are, happening in the fashion industry.
Okay.
But let's get real for a second,
Yeah.
What are some of the hard truths that we just can't ignore when it comes to achieving true sustainability?
Well, I think one of the biggest hurdles is just the sheer scale of the industry.
Right.
Fast fashion has created this global system that's incredibly complex and so deeply entrenched,
Yeah.
And changing that system requires a monumental effort from literally all sides.
Yeah. And let's not forget about consumer behavior.
Oh, yeah.
We've become so accustomed to low prices and that constant novelty.
Right.
And shifting that mindset to embrace quality over quantity,
Yeah.
to value durability and longevity, that's a massive cultural shift.
It is. It's a challenge that goes beyond just individual choices.
Right.
It requires addressing those underlying systems that perpetuate overconsumption.
Yeah.
And this throwaway culture that we have.
So it's not just about swapping out our fast fashion habits for more sustainable choices.
You're right.
It's about questioning the very foundations of our consumerist society.
Yeah.
That's a pretty daunting task.
It is, but I think there's this growing awareness that this level of consumption is just simply unsustainable.
Yeah.
Both from an environmental and social perspective.
We can't keep treating the planet and its resources as infinite.
Right.
And we can't ignore the human cost of our insatiable desire for cheap clothing.
We can't.
But even if we're being honest, with all the good intentions and innovative solutions, isn't there a risk that sustainable fashion just becomes another marketing trend?
Oh, for sure. There's definitely a risk of greenwashing, brands jumping on the sustainability bandwagon without actually making any meaningful changes.
Right.
That's why transparency is so crucial.
So consumers need to be able to see through the marketing hype
Right.
and make informed choices.
Yeah.
How can we be more discerning consumers, and how can we hold these brands accountable?
Well, first off, don't be afraid to ask questions,
Okay.
Look beyond those buzzwords and actually dig deeper into a brand's practices.
Yeah.
See if they're certified by any reputable organizations like Fair Trade or GOTS, the Global Organic Textile Standard.
Cool.
And remember, no brand is perfect.
Right.
It's about progress, not perfection.
So it's about supporting brands that are making genuine efforts to improve their sustainability,
Exactly.
even if they haven't achieved complete perfection yet.
Yeah.
But what about those of us who can't afford to only buy from sustainable brands?
Right.
Are there ways to be more mindful consumers, even within a limited budget?
Absolutely. You can start by simply buying less.
Okay.
Take a good look at your wardrobe and see what you truly need versus what you simply want.
Yeah.
And remember, the most sustainable clothes are often the ones you already own.
That's such a good reminder.
It is.
We can extend the life of our clothes by taking care of them properly, learning those basic repair skills, and even getting creative with upcycling.
Yeah, all those things.
So we've got individual actions,
Right.
industry initiatives, and these legislative efforts.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like there's a lot happening on multiple fronts.
Yeah, there is.
But I'm curious what makes you hopeful about the future of fashion. What are you most excited about?
Well, what gives me hope is this growing awareness and engagement that we're seeing from consumers, particularly like younger generations.
Right?
They're demanding transparency, they're holding brands accountable, and they're driving this whole conversation forward.
Yeah. They're not just passively accepting the status quo.
No, they're not.
They're actively shaping a more sustainable and ethical future for fashion.
They are, and it's inspiring.
Yeah.
And from like a technological standpoint, I'm really excited about the potential of innovations like 3D printing
Oh, yeah.
and bio-based materials.
Interesting.
Those could revolutionize the way we design and produce clothes,
Wow.
reduce waste and like our reliance on those traditional manufacturing processes.
It sounds like we're on the cusp of like a major transformation in the fashion industry.
It feels that way.
But if we had to distill everything we've discussed down to one key takeaway, what would it be?
Well, for me, it's the recognition that fashion isn't just about aesthetics or trends.
Right.
It's about our interconnectedness with the planet and with each other.
It's about making choices that reflect our values
Yeah,
and contribute to a more sustainable and just world.
exactly. It's about recognizing that our clothes have a story,
Right.
from the materials they're made of to the people who made them.
Yeah.
And it's about making sure that story is one we can be proud of.
That's a really powerful message to end on.
It is.
So to our listeners,
Yeah.
we encourage you to keep exploring these issues, keep
Right.
asking questions,
Yeah.
and use your voices and your choices to support a more sustainable and ethical fashion future.
And we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and empowered you to become more conscious consumers. And remember, even those small changes can have a ripple effect.
So join us in shaping a fashion industry that values people and the planet
Right.
as much as it values profit and trends.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep learning, stay engaged. Let's continue this conversation together.
Yeah. Yes, let's do it.